All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Leo Hollen, and I'm here with Marc Saltarelli, who is the director of Studio One Forever. It's the untold story of America's iconic disco, a kaleidoscope of excursion into LGBTQ history that I really, really enjoyed. It's going to be premiering at Out on Film on Sunday, September 24th. Marc, thank you so much for being here and answering a few questions with us. We really appreciate it. Um,
Oh, thank you for having me. I
of
appreciate
course,
it.
of course. First, what I wanted to say is that I absolutely love the movie. I really love exploring queer culture, especially the queer dance and club scene. And I just wanted to ask first, what made you want to take on this subject and tackle this subject? Was it the possible demise? Was it the history of the club? And did you always want it to be sort of this bigger love letter to the 70s and 80s gay disco scene, or did that just kind of happen as you researched?
Yeah, I mean, kind of all of the above. I was brought the project by Backlot producer. Backlot was the nightclub that was, sort of the same business of Studio One. Lloyd Coleman said they were planning this reunion event before the building would be demolished, supposedly, and he wanted to know if I could make a documentary. And I started researching it and found out, all of this incredible history. It opened in 1974. Scott Forbes opened it. And it went all the way through, the excitement of the gay civil rights movement into the 80s. And we all know what happened during that decade. So it was like this perfect opportunity to kind of explore all of that gay history that is now history, that so many people are forgetting, possibly, younger generations who don't have those memories. They have no idea what happened. And it was like the perfect vehicle to sort of through the lens of the club, kind of look at that whole era. And so my hope has always been that it would be a universal film, not just people who experienced it, which were thousands of people. I mean, the place held over 1,000 people for 20 years every night. So, a lot of people do have personal memories of it, but we've started screening at different festivals like North Carolina, and nobody had ever heard of Studio One, and that didn't seem to matter. They just transposed the club that they went to in North Carolina, and the effect is kind of the same.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's sort of a refresher course for those of us who lived through it, and it's education possibly for some of the younger generation who only know TikTok. I know you're part of that younger generation, so no shade there.
Oh, no shade taken, all tea, understood. But going along that line, what this movie really does is takes us back to a time when in the club and in the discotheque, which is what, Studio One was, people were very much in the moment and dancing and just feeling free. And I wondered when you were making this and editing this project, was the idea of being in the moment something that you were really trying to focus on, or was in the back of your head? Because now, like you said, we have all these apps and people are in the club and they're looking at their phone as opposed to really dancing and mingling and meeting people there, or meeting their one night stand there. They're on their phone waiting until the
Right.
club is over and then sending a message then.
Yeah, I mean, obviously our core audience would be people who lived through it, but my real focus was hopefully to appeal to the younger generation that has no idea of not only the significance of Studio One, but just that whole era and what we went through to get the kind of rights that we have today, like gay marriage is taken for granted, AIDS is taken for granted. You take a pill, it's not a big deal, and people, younger guys who saw it like at Outfest when we premiered it, came up to me and said, "My God, I had no idea what you guys went through." And you know, so it's hopefully going to reach more of those people and be enlightening. And it took. I started doing this in 2019, and finally now we're getting it out on the festival circuit. And in a way, I think it's really great that we had this delay and it took so long to kind of get it completed because this moment that we're going through right now, 2 years ago, we weren't being targeted. Now we're being targeted once again, and the film deals with the way the world was back then. And if we're not careful, it's going to go back to that, you know?
Exactly. I completely agree, and it's kind of terrifying. And I mean, I really appreciate the fact that you did deal with, which is sort of like you had to deal with it, was the AIDS epidemic and how it sort of took over that decade in the 80s. How did you really deal with balancing the joy and the love that this community and this club brought to people while knowing that the AIDS epidemic was going to rear its head in the 80s? I think Greg Gorman in the beginning, like you sort of planted this seed. He says, there's still so few of us around. And he
Right.
was talking about looking back at the people who came and the bartenders. And yeah, I was just wondering, like, how do you balance the darkness of that time, not even just the AIDS epidemic, but also the owners,
Right.
racism and sexism. Like, how did you
Yeah.
find the balance as an editor and filmmaker?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the AIDS epidemic is in the back of everyone's mind, but I wanted the film to initially be kind of a joyful ride through that whole era and the music and the excitement and the joy, and save kind of the AIDS epidemic for right after that. And it's very emotional kind of moment when we start dealing with that, after having all of these joyful memories and experiences. And then, just like it did for us personally, AIDS hit, and, people started dying everywhere. You lost so many friends. So it sort of does what it did for all, it did to all of us. And the title Studio One Forever is sort of like the PTSD of that time, lives with us forever, both the joy and the pain. And they both kind of exist. And we have to remember what we went through and share it with younger guys who uh, don't realize that gay marriage could easily be taken away again. And as far as the racism, that was a surprise to me. I had been to Studio One around 1983 or 84. And by that time, Scott Forbes had probably healed himself from that. But in the 70s and in the research, there was a huge protest and boycott. First off, he didn't want women, so he came up with the no open-toed shoes policy, because most women, would have nice shoes, and he didn't want people of color, which is ridiculous. But whether he was racist or not, you can make your own judgment on that. It's just the way he was, and it inspired other people. I mean, to open like Circus Disco, the owner of that. I didn't get that in the film, but he was so outraged by the discrimination that he opened a club that was open policy, but it was primarily for Latino people. And of course, Jules Catch One was also there. So yeah, who knows if he was a racist or not, but that's all in the film. We don't like shy away from it. Um, it's just the way it was.
Exactly, exactly. Um, because you're talking about there's a lot of stuff that's not in the film. Like as an editor, I'm an editor as well. Like I was just curious, how long was your first cut? Because I'm sure you so much stuff that you
Yeah.
couldn't put in.
Yeah. Oh, it was 2.5 hours
Yeah, yeah,
long. Yeah. Um, and yeah, I mean, there is so much great material, like Leo and Lance, which was the famous gay porn film that most people, remember of a certain age. There's a whole episode of Leo and Lance that's already created that I had to cut out. Um, so yeah, I had to make a lot of difficult decisions and try to bring it down to 90 minutes and make it flow. But there is definitely an entire docu series and possibly narrative series, in this, because like everybody who went there has a story. So they
Nice.
could go on forever.
That was one of my questions. I was just curious, like, were you going to do something with the extra footage? Like you
Yeah.
said, docu-series, possibly a narrative series, which could be really
Mhm.
interesting. Is that something that they're currently like pursuing, or is it just like an idea?
Yeah. And we have a sales agent who just recently came on board, and hopefully we can get a distributor, Netflix, Hulu, or HBO, or one of those. That's our dream. And then kind of take it from there. If we don't do a docu-series, I'm just going to release some of these sequences that I had to remove. I'm definitely going to share them with everyone at some point. And I'm absolutely working on a narrative idea, whether it's a feature film or limited series or something like that. It seems like it lends itself to Ryan Murphy, if Ryan's watching.
I ran. um,
Yeah.
because you, I mean, I'm sure that you were as astounded as I was because you said you went there. You said you went there once, or you've been there. You went there a few times.
uh, yeah, I came out in Chicago, started
Mhm.
going to Columbia College, and then moved out here to finish school in LA at Loyola Marymount, which is a Catholic university. They have a great film program.
Mhm.
But I heard about Studio One. It was like famous. Everybody knew about it. So I would go on weekends and check it out. I didn't rip my shirt off and join the jumping masses or anything like that. I was pretty shy. But yeah, I have these incredible memories of that place, and to be the one who is filming in that space, I mean, it just felt like a whole different place. Like in my memory, it just was bigger than it was, but it was huge, you know.
Mhm.
And and like I said, I had no idea what happened before me. I always thought it was a ripoff of Studio 54, when in reality it was way before 54. And Steve Rubell and Halston actually were friends of Scott Forbes. They came, they saw what was going on, and they created Studio 54, were inspired by it. Of course, 54 was only around for like less than 3 years, and this place was around for 20 years. I mean, that's a huge chunk of time. And that's why it was just perfect to kind of look at that whole era through this place.
I love that. Were you as astounded as I was watching this, like when you were doing your research and finding out like Betty Davis, Diana Ross,
Mhm.
Barbara Streisand, like they were
Yeah,
frequenting this place that you went to dance in? Like how did it feel realizing like, oh, this is huge. This is
yeah,
history no one knows about. Like I didn't know about that, and it's wild.
yeah. It was so surprising to me, and they were going to be, the developer had purchased it, and they were going to demolish the building. That's sort of the present day story. And there was an outcry from the local residents, people who remembered it and wanted to preserve it. And two lesbians actually joined together and created Save the Factory, and they did interviews with a lot of people that I would later interview for the film,
Mhm.
and gave it historical preservation status. And all of that was just available online. It was like a 60-page document, and after I read it, I thought, oh my God, this is a story that nobody knows about. And it was thrilling to be able to like bring that history out, so that people can understand, the impact not only of that place, but of the people that lived through that time.
That's amazing. Was curious also, because you said like Studio 54, it was only around for a few years and it came after Studio
Mhm.
One. Do you think that so many people don't know about Studio One because you know, as a community, there was this fight against, there was a fight, in to stop AIDS and the AIDS epidemic. Do you think that and it's sort of like very outwardly, we are a queer space that was fighting against this AIDS epidemic. Do you think that was a reason why it sort of got pushed in the shadows when everyone knows Studio 54 and there were all these
Right.
movies made about it and it's this myth?
That's a really good question. I have no idea why it just sort of got shoved under the bed, this history that was there. I do know somebody else had tried to make the film before I
Mhm.
did, but yeah, yeah, who knows why? But certainly Studio 54 was more like a crime scene. And it wasn't specifically for gay people, but Scott wanted it to be as flawed as his vision was, for gay men only, and usually white gay men, unfortunately. But that was the first, because before Studio One opened in LA, the bars that existed from the 60s and 70s were kind of secret entrances, and you kind of had to look over your shoulder. But his was open. You had to stand in line to get in through the
Mhm.
door policy if you could get in, and people would drive by and throw bottles, at people in the line, or yell faggot or whatever.
Mhm.
So it was the first time that people were brave enough, and of course the culture was starting to happen, for gay rights. So yeah, it was groundbreaking, and it deserves to be known for its flaws and for what it did for the community in general.
Indeed, indeed. And one of the few last final questions I have is like, as a filmmaker, talking filmmaker, like, what was the hardest challenge in creating this? I know that obviously, there must have been some funding issues because of this
Mhm.
documentary in 2023, but what were some of the personal obstacles that you faced making this a reality?
Well, yeah, I had an idea of what the film would be when we first started shooting the initial interviews, but to condense, all those years and all of those stories into one cohesive narrative was really difficult, and it took a kind of a long time of working with a lot of people who gave me advice and that I respect. Stephen Israel, Michael Alden, my two main producers on it were incredible in helping me with that, and Marc Dashnaw, who's a consulting editor. So it was definitely a process. I wouldn't want to. We had a before we actually locked the cut. I had a screening to get feedback from an audience, which is really difficult to do because it's so raw. But I got a lot of great feedback from that, and yeah, that was the big part. And of course, it's a documentary and about music, so music is extremely expensive. But we had this wonderful man, Alan Eichler, who appears in the film. He's my Betty Davis guy. I
Mhm.
got to make a movie that has Betty Davis in it. It's thrilling for me. Uh, he not only provides that beautiful sequence about Betty Davis, but he stepped up and gave us the funding to pay for the music that's paid for. So we owe a lot to him. Actually, his boyfriend was Carlton Carpenter, who is dedicated to in the end, who passed away. And you may remember him from Debbie Reynolds' movies. He was the young guy who sings Yabba Dabba Dabba Dabba, that song. Anyway, they were boyfriends, and he decided not to leave anything to his family, but to leave it to Alan. And so it's actually coming from Carlton,
Wow,
which is kind of cool. Yeah,
that's amazing. That's so
yeah,
beautiful. Wow, that's really, really great.
yeah.
I just want to say that having watched the film, obviously, I really, really loved the way you took the time to center the club goers and the bartenders. When, knowing the history of the club, you could have clearly, spent the time talking about the famous names that came through the door, but
Mhm.
you really made sure that the heart of the movie were the bartenders and were these club goers and were the people that really were there on the ground, making it a reality. And thanks for that.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone feels the heart of the movie is the front bartender, Michael Koth, who
absolutely.
shares his journey, not only during those times, but after. And it just breaks my heart every time I see that part of the movie. Makes it
Yeah.
very powerful. And John Duran is also another important part. He was a city councilman and was mayor of West Hollywood for a long time. So he and a Studio One regular, and his story just breaks my heart as well.
Yeah.
Really brings it home. I mean, I always, being a narrative filmmaker originally, I want to just bring the same kind of humanity and emotional response in a documentary film because they're really the same thing. They're just real people.
Indeed. Um, Again, Mark, I just want to say thank you so much for making a great movie that takes the history, takes this time capsule, and presents it to all of us, and especially a younger generation. I really loved it, and I really, really do hope that you're able to, make this series of the extra footage, this narrative, because I can't wait to see what else I don't know about this because
That's
it's
great.
it's a great story that everyone needs to hear. So
Thank you,
thank
Leo.
you, indeed, indeed.
There's a lot more to come. So stay tuned. Yeah.
Yay, I'm so
All right.
excited. Again, thank you, Mark, for talking to us. He is the filmmaker behind Studio One Forever, which premieres at Out on Film Sunday, September 24th. You can also stream it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leo.